The gold band on Robert Hartwell's right hand caught the morning light the same way it always did, throwing a small, warm circle onto the dusty floorboards of the general store. And every single day that little circle of light reminded him why he had ridden into Caldwell, Kansas in the first place. It was the autumn of 1877, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a man leaning against a fence post, half civilized and half wild, the kind of town where cattle drovers spent their wages on whiskey and card games before turning back south, and where decent families tried to build something permanent in the cracks between those two worlds. The railroad had not yet reached Caldwell in full force, though everyone in the county knew it was coming, and that promise of iron rails kept the town alive with a nervous, buzzing energy, like a hive that had not yet decided what it was going to become. Robert Hartwell was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were roughed from fence work and rope work, and the kind of daily labor that builds a man slowly from the outside in. His hair was dark brown and always slightly too long because he forgot to visit the barber until people started looking at him sideways, and his eyes were the color of creek water in late summer, a greenish, shifting gray that looked different depending on the light. He owned a small cattle operation about 7 miles outside of town, 43 head, a solid barn, a house that needed a woman's touch in every room, and a reputation for being fair and quiet and utterly reliable. He paid his debts. He showed up when he said he would. He did not drink to excess, and he had never started a fight in his life, though he had finished two. The ring had belonged to his father, Edmund Hartwell, who had come west from Virginia in 1851, with a young wife named Clara, and a determination that had outlasted almost everything else about him. Edmund had placed the ring on Clara's finger the night he proposed to her in a small parlor in Richmond, and Clara had worn it for 31 years until she died of fever in the spring of 1874. Edmund had followed her 18 months later, quietly and without much drama, the way men follow women they cannot live without. Robert had been the one to sit with his father in those last weeks, and Edmund had pressed the ring into his son's palm one evening when the light was going pink outside the window. "I kept it simple when I gave this to your mother," Edmund had said, his voice already thin and far away. "I just said, here is everything I have to offer." She took it. "Find a woman who deserves it, Robert. Not a woman who wants it, a woman who deserves it." Robert had not fully understood the difference then. He thought he was beginning to understand it now. He wore the ring on his right hand because it was not yet meant for anyone's left. Every morning when he rode into Caldwell to collect mail or buy supplies or simply to sit with the world for a while, the ring rode with him, gold and plain and without any inscription, just a circle that meant everything. He was not a romantic man by nature, or at least he would not have described himself that way, but the ring had become something he could not separate from his daily life. It was a compass of sorts, a question he was always carrying and had not yet found the answer to. He had spent 3 years looking, quietly and without any drama, the way he did everything. He had been introduced to the schoolteacher, Miss Agnes Fowler, who was kind but talked only about leaving Kansas and getting back to Ohio. He had shared a meal with the widow Calloway, who was perfectly pleasant but looked at his cattle operation the way a woman looks at a problem she is already calculating how to solve. He had danced once with a girl named Nellie Marsh at the Harvest Social, and Nellie had been lovely and bright and 20 years old, and had spent the entire dance talking about a drover named Pete Duggan, who she was clearly in love with. Robert had wished her well genuinely, and walked home content in his solitude if not exactly happy about it. The difference between those women and the woman his father had described was something Robert felt rather than knew. It was in his chest, a kind of quiet readiness, a sense that when the right person was in front of him, he would recognize it the way you recognize a song you heard once as a child. You cannot explain how you know it. You just know. He was standing outside Hargrove's General Store on a Tuesday morning in early October, 1877, tying his horse to the post and watching the town begin its day, when the wagon came in from the north road. It was not a remarkable wagon. It was a single-horse affair, a brown mare pulling a flat bed with a canvas tarp over what appeared to be most of the contents of a household, chairs, and a bureau and boxes that had been stacked with care and tied with rope. The driver was a woman, and Robert noticed her first because she was handling the reins with a kind of controlled competence that was immediately apparent, not white-knuckling it the way a frightened driver does, but holding the lines with easy authority, reading the horse the way experienced drivers do, giving just enough and taking just enough. She pulled up alongside the water trough at the center of Caldwell's Main Street, which was called Commerce Street, because someone had thought that sounded hopeful, and she set the brake with a firm push of her boot and climbed down from the seat without any of the hesitation a stranger in an unfamiliar town might show. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up under a bonnet that had seen better days, and her dress was a deep green that had faded some but still held its color in the morning light. She was not conventionally small or delicate-looking. She was a woman who looked like she had been doing real work her whole life, with straight shoulders and a direct way of holding her head that reminded Robert oddly of the way his mother used to stand. She spoke to the mare quietly while the horse drank, patting its neck, and then she looked up and down Commerce Street with the measured gaze of someone taking inventory rather than someone feeling lost. Robert realized he had stopped moving entirely and was just standing next to his own horse watching her, which was not a thing he normally did. He looked away, checked the knot on his reins even though it was perfectly fine, and went into Hargrove's store to collect his mail. There were 2 letters, one from his cousin James in Wichita and one from the bank in which he held a small but useful account, and he tucked them into his coat pocket without reading them and browsed the canned goods with no particular purpose because he was listening for the bell above the door. He heard it 6 minutes later. She came in with the same directness she had shown on the street, and Raymond Hargrove, who was behind the counter with his reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead, looked up and said, "Morning, miss," in the automatic way of a man who had been greeting customers for 20 years. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was low and clear, the kind of voice that carried without being loud. "I was hoping you could help me. I am looking for Mr. Daniel Croft. He owns property on the south side of town, I believe a house on Maple and 2nd. Raymond thought about it. Croft used to own property there, yes. Sold it in June, though, moved himself up to Wichita. There was a pause, brief but complete. Robert, who was pretending to read the label on a tin of peaches, did not look up, but he was paying close attention. "I see," she said. "He was expecting me. We had an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Raymond asked, not unkindly, just curious the way small-town men are. "He was my uncle, was going to let me rent the house while I found a teaching position. I wrote him in August and he wrote back saying to come ahead." She stopped. "I did not know he had sold." Raymond scratched the back of his neck. "I am sorry, miss, I genuinely am. The house went to the Kimball family, young couple. They are living there now." Another pause. Robert set down the tin of peaches. "Is there a boarding house in town?" she asked, and her voice was still steady, still collected, though Robert could hear something underneath it, not panic but the controlled exercise of keeping panic at a distance. "Mrs. Alderman runs one on Oak Street," Raymond said. "It is decent. She charges $3 a week, meals included." "Thank you," she said. "And is there a school board or a committee I might speak with about teaching positions? I have my certificate from the Kansas State Normal School." Raymond's expression shifted into something warmer. "Mrs. Foster runs the board, more or less. Her husband is the actual chairman, but everyone knows she does the work. You can find her at the church on Tuesdays, which today happens to be." "That is fortunate," the woman said, and there was something in those words, a small, dry humor, a kind of wry acknowledgement of the irony of finding one small good thing in the middle of everything going sideways. Robert liked it immediately. He turned from the shelf and said, "Excuse me," which was a thing he almost never did to a stranger, and both she and Raymond looked at him. "I could not help overhearing," he said, which was not entirely true since he had been actively listening, but it was a polite fiction, and she seemed to accept it as such. "Mrs. Foster is at the church right now. I passed it on the way in. You would not need to wait if you went straight there." She looked at him directly, and he saw that her eyes were hazel, a warm brown-green that shifted like the light on shallow water, and that she was taking stock of him in a frank, unhurried way that he found entirely disarming. "Thank you," she said. "That is useful." "Robert Hartwell," he said, because it seemed the right thing to do, and he held out his right hand. She looked at the hand, and he was aware of the ring, sitting there plain and gold on his finger, not because he had forgotten it, but because he was always aware of it, and then she shook his hand with a firm, dry grip. "Beatrice Leland," she said. He had shaken hands with dozens of women in his life. He could not have explained why this one felt different. It was not dramatic. There was no particular electricity or any of the overwrought things people described in the dime novels that circulated through town. It was simply that he shook her hand and then he did not want to stop talking to her, which was unusual for a man who was naturally comfortable with silence. "Are you new to Caldwell yourself, Mr. Hartwell, or have you lived here long?" She asked, and the question was conversational, but she was still looking at him directly, which most people did not do. 7 years, he said. "I have a cattle operation outside of town." "Then you know this place well." "Well enough," he said. "Mrs. Foster is a fair woman. If you have your certificate, she will listen to you seriously." Beatrice nodded once, and he could see her processing this, filing it away, adjusting her plan. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell," she said again, and she meant it, that was clear. She was not the kind of person who said things she did not mean. She bought a small packet of flour and a jar of molasses, which Raymond wrapped in brown paper, and then she left the store and the bell above the door rang again, and Raymond looked at Robert with the particular expression of a married man who has been watching unmarried men fail to act for decades. "She is something," Raymond said. "She is," Robert agreed, which was more than he usually said about anyone, and he paid for the peaches he had not intended to buy and went back out into the morning. Beatrice Leland was already halfway down Commerce Street, walking with that same straight-shouldered, purposeful stride, the packet of flour under one arm and her bonnet strings untied and trailing, and Robert stood next to his horse for a moment, watching the distance between them grow and feeling the particular weight of inaction, which was something he understood very well. He rode home with his letters unread in his pocket and spent the afternoon fixing a section of fence that did not strictly need fixing and thinking about hazel eyes and a voice that carried without being loud. Beatrice found Mrs. Foster at the church, as Robert had said she would, and Mrs. Foster was a compact, formidable woman of 52 who wore her silver hair pulled back so severely it looked architectural. She listened to Beatrice's credentials with her hands folded in her lap and her expression neutral in a way that could have meant anything. And when Beatrice finished speaking, Mrs. Foster asked 3 questions. The first question was about Beatrice's experience with children of varying ages, since the Caldwell schoolhouse served students from 6 to 16 in a single room. The second question was about her views on discipline, which was a question that local parents had opinions about. The third question was about whether she intended to stay. "I intend to build a life here," Beatrice said, which was both more and less than Mrs. Foster had asked, but it was the truest answer Beatrice had. She had grown up in Abilene, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Beatrice was 11, and she had been raised in that gap between those two facts, learning everything her father could teach her and filling in the rest herself. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving her with a certificate, a small amount of savings, and the absolute clarity that she was not going to spend her life waiting for something to happen to her. The arrangement with her Uncle Daniel had seemed like a reasonable beginning. Now it was gone, and she was in Caldwell with her wagon and her furniture and $47, and a determination that was going to have to substitute for a plan until she could make a better one. Mrs. Foster told her that the previous teacher, a young man named Mr. Hall, had left in August to study law in Topeka, and that the school board had been making do with a rotating arrangement of volunteers and parents that satisfied no one. She could not promise a permanent position without consulting the full board, but she could say that if the full board met on Thursday and Beatrice was willing to be present, she thought the outcome would be favorable. Beatrice thanked her and meant it, and went to Mrs. Alderman's boarding house on Oak Street, which turned out to be a wide, clean house with a porch that got the afternoon sun and a landlady who had 7 cats and no patience for nonsense, and a heart that was entirely soft underneath the surface of things. Mrs. Alderman, whose first name was Josephine but who nobody called Josephine, looked Beatrice up and down when she answered the door and said, "You have been driving a long way." "4 days, Beatrice said. "Come in and eat something first, then we will talk about the room." The room was small but had a good window that faced east and cost $3 a week as Raymond had said, and Beatrice took it and paid the first week in advance and felt, for the first time since she had arrived to find her uncle's house occupied by strangers, like she might actually be able to make this work. She spent that first evening writing in the journal she had kept since she was 14, not a diary exactly but a working document, a place where she thought through problems on paper. She wrote about the town, which seemed livelier than she had expected and not unfriendly. She wrote about the school board meeting on Thursday and what she intended to say. She wrote briefly and with a certain self-awareness about the fact that she was doing it, about the man in Hargrove's store, Robert Hartwell, who had overheard her situation and told her something useful without making a production of it, and who had shaken her hand like she was a person rather than a woman, and who had worn a plain gold ring on his right hand that she had noticed without meaning to. She closed the journal and told herself firmly that she had more pressing concerns. On Thursday, the school board met and offered Beatrice the teaching position at a salary of $35 a month, with the understanding that this was provisional for the first 3 months and would become permanent if the arrangement suited both parties. She said yes without any hesitation at all. Raymond Hargrove's wife, a cheerful round-faced woman named Dolers, heard about it the next morning and told every person she encountered that day. So by Friday afternoon most of Caldwell knew there was a new schoolteacher in town. Robert heard it from his neighbor, Clem Patterson, who rode over on Friday morning to borrow a length of rope and stayed for coffee. "New teacher's a woman," Clem said with the air of someone imparting significant news. "From Abilene, came in Tuesday." "I know," Robert said. Clem looked at him. "You know, I met her at Hargrove's on Tuesday morning." Clem was a good-natured man who had been married for 15 years and had 4 children and regarded Robert's unmarried state with a kind of affectionate bafflement. "And," he said. "And nothing," Robert said. "I told her where to find Mrs. Foster." "That was it, Clem." "I am just asking. She has just arrived in town and had a difficult day," Robert said. It was not the moment to be anything other than useful. Clem drank his coffee and did not say anything else, but the quality of his silence was extremely loud. Robert rode into town the following Monday with his weekly list of errands, and found Commerce Street substantially more populated than usual for a Monday morning, which he eventually traced to the fact that several parents were apparently congregating near the schoolhouse, which was on the corner of Commerce and 3rd, to observe the new teacher's first official day. He did not go and look. He did his errands methodically, visited the bank, collected his mail, bought the nails and the lamp oil and the salt he needed, and was loading his saddlebags when he heard a voice he recognized from across the street. Beatrice was on the steps of the schoolhouse, and she was talking to a boy of about 12 who had the look of a child who has decided in advance that he is not going to cooperate. Robert could not hear the words, but he could see the conversation clearly, Beatrice steady and unhurried, the boy defensive and angled slightly away, and then something she said made him look up, and she said something else, and the boy's shoulders came down about 2 inches, which in 12-year-old terms was essentially a full surrender. They both went inside. Robert tied off his saddlebag and stood there feeling something he did not have a good name for. Admiration, certainly. Warmth, yes. And something under both of those that was quieter and deeper, and felt a great deal like recognition. He rode to the post office, which he had already visited, and posted a letter to his cousin James that he had been meaning to write for 3 weeks. Then he rode home and did not think about Beatrice Leland for approximately 40 minutes, which was less than he would have liked. The first time he actually spoke to her at length was at the Harvest Social at the end of October. The Harvest Social was the town's main autumn event, held in the space behind the grain warehouse, which was cleared out and decorated with dried corn and baled hay and paper lanterns that Dolores Hargrove made every year, and hung from the rafters with an intensity that suggested the fate of civilization depended on it. There was a fiddle player named Old Mick, who was neither as old as he looked nor as talented as he thought, and there was food that the town's women contributed in a rotating system that Mrs. Foster managed with the precision of a military campaign. Robert went to the Harvest Social every year because it was the kind of thing a man did if he wanted to be part of a community, and he did want that, even when he was not sure he was very good at it. He wore his good shirt and cleaned his boots and brushed his hat, and the ring on his right hand caught the light of the paper lanterns in the doorway when he arrived. He saw Beatrice almost immediately, which was not difficult because the schoolhouse had been open for 3 weeks, and she was now a known quantity in Caldwell, and several people were talking to her near the food table. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a deep blue that suited her coloring, and she had her hair down from its daytime pins into a loose arrangement at the back of her neck that made her look younger and softer than she did in her professional capacity, though no less direct. He waited until the crowd around her thinned, which took about 20 minutes, during which he talked to Clem and Clem's wife Martha, and a cattle broker named Jefferson Price who was in from Wichita, and wanted to discuss the market price of yearlings, which was a conversation Robert was genuinely interested in, but half of his attention was elsewhere, and Jefferson Price probably noticed. When he finally made his way to the food table, Beatrice was pouring herself a cup of cider from the large ceramic jug that Mrs. Alderman had contributed, and she looked up when he arrived and said, "Mr. Hartwell," with the small, warm recognition of someone who is actually glad to see a familiar face. "Miss Leland," he said, "how is the school going?" "Considerably better than my first 15 minutes suggested," she said. "I have 22 students. 8 of them are genuinely enthusiastic about learning, 7 more can be persuaded with the right approach, and the remaining 7 are waiting to see if I am going to prove them right about teachers being a waste of their time." "Which ones are the skeptics?" "The ones whose families have been farming this land for a generation," she said. "They have learned everything they think they need to know at home. I am not sure they are entirely wrong about that either. But there are things beyond farming, and I intend to show them what those things are." He poured himself a cup of cider. "What kinds of things?" She considered this seriously, which he had already begun to recognize as characteristic of her. She did not give answers she had not actually thought about. "History, for one. These children are living in a time when the country is still deciding what it is going to be. They deserve to understand that they are part of something larger than their own county. And mathematics, because a person who can calculate precisely is a person who cannot be cheated, which matters out here where there is not always a judge within 3 days' ride." "That is a practical argument for education," he said. "I find practical arguments are better received in Caldwell than philosophical ones," she said, and the small dry humor was there again, that wry awareness that made him want to keep talking to hear what she would say next. They talked for 2 hours. He was not fully aware of how much time had passed until Old Mick started a new reel, and Clem Patterson caught his eye from across the room with an expression of theatrical approval. Robert did not acknowledge this. He learned that Beatrice had read everything her father owned, which was a significant library for a Kansas schoolteacher, including a complete set of Shakespeare that she had carried from Abilene wrapped in her winter coat because she would not trust it to the uncertainty of the road. He learned that she had been managing her own household since she was 11, when her mother died, and that this had given her opinions about efficiency and practicality that sometimes surprised people who expected a woman with her education to be impractical. He learned that she had turned down one offer of marriage from a banker in Abilene who was decent and established and would have given her a comfortable life, because she had felt, in her precise and honest way, that comfort and a life were not the same thing. He told her about his cattle operation, about the way the plains looked in early morning when the light came low and gold across the grass, about his father's particular method for reading weather in the behavior of the cattle, which Robert had absorbed without knowing he had, and then discovered he was using. He did not tell her about the ring. That was not a thing you simply said to someone at a harvest social. But he was aware of it on his hand, the way he was always aware of it, warm metal against his skin, carrying its quiet question. Old Mick played 3 more reels and a slow waltz, and the slow waltz was something Robert had been waiting for without admitting it, and he said, "Would you dance?" And she said yes, without any coy hesitation, which was entirely in keeping with everything he had already understood about her. She danced the way she did everything else, with competence and directness, and a lack of self-consciousness that made it easy. He was not a particularly gifted dancer himself, but he was adequate and they managed well together, which he thought was probably a useful piece of information. "You have been in Caldwell 7 years, she said, as they turned slowly in the lamplight. "That is long enough to know everyone." "Most of them," he said. "Do you like it, Caldwell?" "I like my land," he said, and then, because she was the kind of person who warranted more honesty than that, "I like the life I have built here. The town itself is still figuring out what it wants to be. I think it will get there." "I think so too," she said, and the words were quiet and certain, and he felt them settle into him like something finding a home. He walked her back to Mrs. Alderman's boarding house that night, and the October air was cold and full of stars, and the ring on his hand was warm even though the night was not. They stood on the porch for a moment in the kind of silence that is comfortable rather than awkward, and he said good night, and she said good night, and he rode home under all those stars thinking that his father had been right about the difference between wanting and deserving, and that he was beginning to understand it clearly. November came in with wind and a cold that settled into the bones of the plains and made the cattle restless. Robert had extra work during November, mending the windbreak fence on the north side of his property, and laying in enough hay to last through what looked like a hard winter, and he did not get into town as often as he wanted to, which was a new development because he had not, until recently, particularly wanted to get into town. He came in twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, and on Tuesdays the school was in session, and he sometimes passed Beatrice on Commerce Street or saw her through the schoolhouse window, and they would speak briefly, quickly, with the comfortable ease of 2 people who are becoming familiar with each other's rhythms. She would tell him something about her students, or he would mention something about the state of the northern range, and the conversations were short but never felt incomplete. On the 3rd Friday of November, he arrived in town to find a small commotion outside the feed store, which was 3 doors down from Hargrove's. A man had a horse that was in distress, a bay gelding that was clearly lame on the right foreleg, and the man was losing his temper in the way that frightened men sometimes do, talking too loudly and pulling on the horse's lead in a way that was not helping anything. A small crowd had formed in the way small town crowds form, present but not intervening. Robert tied his own horse and walked over and said to the man, who he did not recognize, "Let me look at the leg," in the tone that was not a request, and the man, surprised into compliance, stepped back. The hoof had a stone wedged deeply in the soft tissue, which was painful but not a permanent injury. Robert took out the knife he carried on his belt, which was a working knife and not a weapon, and after a careful minute's work removed the stone, and the horse immediately shifted its weight with visible relief. "You will want to keep him off hard ground for a few days," Robert said to the man, straightening up. "He should be fine." The man, who was perhaps 30 and had the look of a traveling merchant, visibly recalibrated himself from embarrassment to gratitude. "Thank you. I am obliged to you." His foot was hurting him, Robert said simply. He was not being difficult. He became aware, turning back toward Hargroves, that Beatrice was standing a few feet away with two of her students, a girl of about 10 and a boy of about 13, who had apparently been watching the whole thing. The girl was wide-eyed. The boy was doing that carefully neutral face that 13-year-old boys use when they are impressed but refuse to show it. Beatrice was looking at him with an expression he could not quite catalog, warm and thoughtful, and something else that he did not name but that stayed with him for the rest of the day. She came over and said, "Are you always doing things like that?" "Things like what?" "Useful things," she said, quietly. He was not sure what to say to that, which was unusual, so he said, "I like horses," which was true but not the whole truth, and she seemed to know it because she smiled in that small, contained way she had and introduced him to the two students, whose names were Lucy Garrett and Thomas Pryor. And Thomas Pryor shook Robert's hand with the serious ceremony of a boy who intends to be taken seriously. December arrived, and with it the first real snow, which came down across the Kansas plains in long, sweeping curtains that turned the world white and quiet. Robert checked his cattle twice a day and kept the stove in the barn burning, and thanked his past self for laying in the extra hay. He got into town once a week now rather than twice, and each visit felt more purposeful. There was a Christmas gathering at the church in the second week of December, and Robert brought a jar of the honey from his neighbor's bees, which he had traded for labor in the fall, and sat in a pew that happened to be 2 rows behind where Beatrice sat with Mrs. Alderman and 2 other boarders. He was aware of this throughout the readings and the singing of carols, not uncomfortably, but with that particular quality of awareness that had become his constant companion since October. Afterward, when people were gathered in the churchyard and the cold, dark drinking cider heated on a brazier, Beatrice found him near the gate, which he suspected was not entirely accidental on either of their parts. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Hartwell," she said. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Merry Christmas, Miss Leland," he said. "How are your 22 students managing without their teacher for 2 weeks?" "Probably with a great deal of relief," she said, and there was warmth under the dry words, genuine affection for her students. "Though I have given them reading assignments, 3 of them will do the work. The rest will forget they exist until January 2nd and then spend the morning in a panic, which is also a kind of education." He laughed, which was a thing he did not do easily but which she kept drawing out of him without apparent effort. It was not a polished or restrained laugh. It came out fully, and he was not quite prepared for it himself, which made it worse, and she looked at him with frank delight. "You have a good laugh," she said. "You should use it more." He had no idea what to say to that, so he said, "Can I walk you home?" And she said, "Yes, please." And they walked through the snow-quieted streets of Caldwell with the cold sitting cleanly around them and the stars very far away and bright. He said, at the gate of Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, "Beatrice," and then stopped because he had used her first name without planning to and was suddenly conscious of it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Robert," deliberately, and the deliberateness of it, the clear choice she was making, settled something in his chest. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "in the new year, if that would be acceptable." She looked at him in the direct way she had, and he met it, and she said, "I was beginning to wonder if you were going to ask," which told him 2 things simultaneously, that she had been waiting and that she was not going to pretend she had not been. "I am a slow and careful man," he said, which was true and felt important to say. "I know," she said. "I consider that a quality rather than a deficiency." And then she went inside, and Robert walked back through the snow to where his horse was tied in front of the church, and the cold did not bother him at all. January of 1878 came in hard and stayed that way, and the plains outside Caldwell were buried under snow that the wind packed into drifts taller than a man's shoulder against the north face of every building. Robert rode into town through conditions that would have deterred a less determined man, on Tuesdays and Fridays again, because that was what he had told himself he would do, and he was a man who did what he told himself he would do. He came to the schoolhouse on the second Tuesday of January after the students had gone home for the day, and he knocked on the door, which was not a thing anyone particularly needed to do since it was a public building, but it felt right, and Beatrice called for him to come in. She was at the blackboard erasing that day's arithmetic lesson, and the erasure powder made a soft cloud in the late afternoon light that came low and angled through the western windows. She turned when she heard the door. He had brought her a book which had required a specific order through Hargroves that he had placed in December, a copy of Adam Bede by George Eliot, because he had heard her mention Middlemarch in passing and inferred that she valued that particular author's way of looking at the world. He was not certain it was the right book. He was certain the effort was correct. She looked at the cover and then at him, and for a moment she was very still. "You remembered that," she said. "You said it in the churchyard in October," he said. "You were talking to Mrs. Hargrove about it. And you placed the order in December." She said it as a statement, not a question, understanding the timeline. "You said you valued her," he said. "I thought you might not have this one." She held the book with both hands, not carelessly, and he could see that she was moved, not overwhelmed, not performing emotion, but genuinely, quietly moved, and he felt the ring on his right hand as though it had grown slightly heavier. They sat at the two largest student desks, which were still too small for either of them, with the stove burning low in the corner and the snow coming down outside the windows, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about books and about the difference between a story that entertains and a story that changes something in you when you finish it. They talked about the cattle market and the coming of the railroad and what it would mean for Caldwell, which was a question the town was divided on. They talked about her father, whose name had been William Leland, and about Robert's father, Edmund, and about the ways in which the people who form us are present even when they are gone. He told her about Edmund that afternoon, the full version rather than the brief sketch he usually offered, about the man's extraordinary capacity for quiet joy, which was a rare trait in hard country, and about the way he had loved Clara Hartwell without ever making a performance of it, just steadily and completely, as naturally as breathing. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Beatrice said. "He was," Robert said, and then because they had arrived at a moment that had its own gravity, he said, "He gave me his ring before he died." She looked at his right hand where the ring sat plain and gold in the afternoon light. "He told me to find a woman who deserves it," Robert said. "Not one who wants it, one who deserves it. I have been trying to understand the difference." The room was very quiet. The snow outside the windows made no sound at all. "And do you understand it now?" she asked, her voice carefully even, the way a person's voice is when they are feeling something significant and being precise about it. He looked at her. "I think I am getting there," he said, which was honest rather than bold, and she accepted it as such, and they sat in that quiet together for a little while before he rose to go. He called on her formally after that, which in Caldwell in 1878 meant arriving at Mrs. Alderman's on Thursday evenings, where Mrs. Alderman would set them up in the parlor with the door open, and then ostentatiously fail to check on them more than twice an hour. Mrs. Alderman thought Robert Hartwell was exactly right for Beatrice, and thought Beatrice was exactly right for Robert, and was not at all subtle about either opinion. On the first Thursday they played chess, which they were both competent at, and the match was close enough to be interesting and lasted almost 3 hours. He won, but only just, and she said, "Again next week," with the simplicity of someone who intends to do better. On the second Thursday, She read to him from Adam Bede while he sat across from her and listened, which was something he had not experienced since his mother used to read to his father and him on winter evenings in Virginia, and the warmth of it was profound in a way he did not try to articulate. On the third Thursday, they talked about her plans for the spring term, which included a project she had conceived about the history of the Chisholm Trail that would involve the students interviewing adults in town who had been present for the early drives. And he told her about the drives he had seen himself, the way the cattle came through in the early years, thousands and thousands of longhorns raising a dust cloud visible for 20 miles. He had never thought to organize these memories before, but she asked good questions, and he found he had more to say than he had known. On the fourth Thursday, Mrs. Alderman found a reason to be in the kitchen the entire evening, which both Robert and Beatrice were aware of and neither commented on, and they sat closer together than they had before, not touching, just close, and the warmth between them was something they were both quite deliberately not naming yet. The way you do not name a thing until you are sure it can hold the weight of the name. February brought a brief thaw that was treacherous because it iced overnight, and on a Friday morning when Robert came to town, he found Beatrice's horse, the brown mare he had first seen at the water trough, limping on the south side of Commerce Street. The mare had slipped on ice and was favoring her left front leg, and Beatrice was standing beside her in the early morning cold looking at the leg with an expression of controlled worry. "How bad is it?" Robert asked, crouching to examine the leg the way he had with the traveling merchant's horse back in November. "I do not think it is broken," Beatrice said. "She is putting some weight on it." "A strain," he said, after a careful examination. "She needs a day or two of rest and she should be fine." "But she should not be pulling the wagon today." Beatrice nodded, processing this. The wagon was how she got her supplies from the outlying farms of the families whose children she taught, several of whom paid part of her salary in goods rather than money, which was a common arrangement in 1878. "Clem Patterson's farm is closest to the route you usually take," Robert said, standing. "He has stalls. We can put your mare up there today." "That is generous," she said, "but I would not want to inconvenience him." "You would not be," he said. "Clem is the kind of man who considers helping people a pleasure rather than a burden. I will go with you to ask him." She looked at him steadily. "You would do that?" "It is on the way," he said, which was not entirely true since Clem's farm was southeast and Robert's land was north, but she probably knew that. They led the mare together to Clem's farm, which took about 40 minutes at the slow walking pace the horse needed, and Clem received them with exactly the open warmth Robert had predicted, and Martha Patterson came out and gave Beatrice coffee and a piece of corn bread, and Clem and Robert settled the mare in a comfortable stall, and the whole affair had the quality of something falling into its natural shape. On the walk back to town, the cold was sharp but the sky was completely clear and blue, and the ice on the road caught the light and made everything look, briefly, beautiful. "I want to ask you something," Beatrice said, and her directness, which he had always valued, was operating at full capacity. "And I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." "I will try," he said. "Do you enjoy my company because you have decided you should or because you actually do?" He thought about it for a moment seriously, because she had asked for honesty rather than care, and then he said, "I did not decide anything. I met you and I wanted to keep talking to you, and I have wanted that every day since." There is no should about it. She was quiet for a few steps and then she said, "Good, because I feel the same way and I wanted to be certain we were talking about the same thing." "We are," he said. They walked in silence for a while and then she said, "Your father's ring." "Yes. You wear it every day." "Every day I come to town," he said. "I have since he gave it to me." "Why every day you come to town specifically?" He had not been asked this before and the question opened something in him. "Because town is where people are," he said slowly, working through it as he spoke. "And the ring was about a person. My father said to find the woman who deserves it. I could not find her on my own land with nobody there but my cattle and myself, so I brought it to town. Every day I came in, it came with me." Beatrice stopped walking, He stopped too and turned to look at her. Her face was doing something complex and precise that he did not try to reduce to a single word. "Robert," she said. "Yes, I think you have found her." The words were simple and direct and entirely characteristic of her, and they hit him in the chest like the first warm day after a long winter, sudden and complete and altering. He reached up and took the ring from his right hand. He had taken it off only to clean it in all the years he had worn it. He held it in his palm and looked at it, the plain gold circle his father had placed on his mother's finger, the circle that had carried a question for 4 years. "Not here in the road," he said, because despite everything he was still himself, still a man who wanted to do things right. She laughed, and it was a full, genuine laugh, and he thought he had never heard anything he liked more. "No," she agreed, "not here in the road." He asked her properly on a Sunday evening in March, at Mrs. Alderman's parlor, which Mrs. Alderman had excused herself from entirely for the first time in the history of the Thursday evenings, having a suspicion about what the evening contained. He did not make a speech. He said what he meant, which was that he had been carrying his father's ring for 4 years looking for the woman who deserved it, not a woman who was convenient or beautiful or accomplished, though she happened to be all of those things, but a woman who deserved it by virtue of being exactly and fully herself, and that he had found that woman and her name was Beatrice Leland. She said yes. She said it plainly and immediately and with her whole face open and warm, and he put the ring on the 3rd finger of her left hand, where it had not been since his mother, and it fit, not perfectly, because things rarely are, but well enough that it held. They were married in May of 1878 at the Caldwell church on a Saturday morning when the plains were green and wide, and the sky was the particular blue of Kansas in late spring that looks like something out of a painting someone made up. The whole town came, or nearly all of it. Raymond and Dolores Hargrove were there, and Clem and Martha Patterson, and Mrs. Alderman, who cried with great productivity and no embarrassment. Mrs. Foster came and sat in the 2nd row and looked deeply satisfied, as though she had arranged the whole thing herself, which was not true but which she had certainly not discouraged. Old Mick played at the celebration afterward, and he played better than usual because the occasion warranted it, and because someone had spoken to him seriously about his tempo, which Robert suspected had been Beatrice. They danced twice, and the second time he held her closer than was strictly formal, and she did not object, and he could feel his father's ring, now his mother's ring, now his wife's ring, on her hand where it rested on his shoulder. They moved into Robert's house that weekend, and Beatrice moved through its rooms with the same measuring, practical eye she turned on everything, making lists in her head, and then on paper of what was needed and what needed to change. The house was solid and well built, and had been lonely for a woman's presence in a way that became obvious the moment one was present. She arranged her Shakespeare in the front room in a place of honor on the shelf Robert built for her from the good pine he had been storing, and she brought a rug from her wagon that her mother had made, blue and red in a pattern of interlocking shapes, and laid it in front of the hearth, and the room was transformed. Robert watched her do these things with a feeling in his chest that he could only compare to the word home, which he had thought he already had, but now understood he had only had the building. The first summer of their marriage was extraordinary, not without difficulty, because the cattle market fluctuated, and the summer of 1878 was dry, and they had to source water from the creek rather than the well for 6 weeks in August. And there were hard days and short-tempered evenings, and one real argument about the household accounts that lasted 2 days before they resolved it by sitting down together, with the ledger and Beatrice showing Robert a system of record-keeping that was considerably cleaner than the one he had been using. She was right, which he admitted, and he said so plainly, which she valued. But it was extraordinary because they were building something together, which was different from building something alone, even if the physical labor was sometimes identical. She rode out with him in the morning sometimes, on the brown mare whose leg had healed completely, and the sight of her on horseback in the early light across his land made something in him expand beyond the boundaries he had thought he had. She continued teaching. They had discussed this before the marriage, and Robert had been clear that he had no intention of asking her to stop. Teaching was what she had come to Caldwell to do, and she was genuinely excellent at it, and he would not have respected himself if he had asked her to lay it down. She taught through the fall term and the winter and the next spring, and her 22 students became 26 as families arrived with the railroad workers who were coming closer now, the rails pushing steadily toward Caldwell from the north. The railroad arrived in Caldwell in 1880, and with it came the full force of the cattle trade boom that the town had been bracing for. Caldwell became, in short order, one of the busiest shipping points on the Southern Trail, and Commerce Street changed, new buildings going up, the population swelling with drovers and merchants, and the various establishments that sprung up to serve both. It was a different town from the one Beatrice had driven into in 1877, louder and more crowded and more prosperous and more chaotic, all of those things simultaneously. Robert's operation grew with it. He had 43 head when Beatrice arrived, and by 1880 he had 90. And by 1881 he had contracts with 2 separate buyers out of Wichita and was considering whether to expand the land. He and Beatrice talked about these decisions together, at the kitchen table after dinner with the lamp burning between them, and her practical intelligence was as valuable in these conversations as it was in the schoolroom, because she could see both the human and the economic dimensions of a choice simultaneously. In January of 1880, Beatrice told Robert she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a cold morning, directly and without ceremony, because that was how she did things, but her face was open and soft, and he could see that she was feeling something large that she was being careful with. He was quiet for a moment, processing, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her carefully, both arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood there in the warmth from the stove without talking. The baby arrived in September of 1880, a healthy boy they named Edmund after Robert's father, and Robert was there the whole time, which was not the universal custom but which he would not have surrendered for anything. When the doctor placed the baby in his arms, Robert looked down at the small red face of his son and felt something that went beyond any word he could produce, a kind of pure, factual love, unearned and total, and he thought about his father pressing the ring into his palm and saying, "Find a woman who deserves it," and he understood, finally and completely, the full weight of what Edmund had meant. Beatrice watched him hold their son with an expression that he caught in a quiet moment and that he kept in his memory for the rest of his life. She was tired and she had worked hard, and she was looking at him with the most open face he had ever seen on a human being, all the directness and intelligence still present but all the careful control of them set aside, just love, straightforward and complete. Edmund Hartwell grew steadily and well, with his mother's hazel eyes and his father's calm, which was a useful combination in a frontier boy. He was curious and physical and opinionated in ways that clearly came from both parents, and the house that had needed a woman's touch and then received it now needed a child's energy and received that too. In March of 1882, Beatrice told Robert she was expecting again. This time he knew earlier because he had learned to read her the way he read the weather in the cattle, in small accumulative signs. The second child was another boy, born in October of 1882, and they named him William after Beatrice's father. William Hartwell was different from his brother from the beginning, quieter and more interior, a child who watched the world with serious eyes and thought about what he saw before responding to it. Beatrice recognized something of herself in him and loved him fiercely. Robert recognized something of his father in the boy's quality of quiet joy and loved that in him. By 1883, Robert's cattle operation was substantial and stable. He had 112 head, 2 hired hands, a solid relationship with buyers in Wichita and one in Kansas City, and a bank account that no longer required careful management because there was enough in it that the management had become a pleasure rather than a necessity. He still rode into town several times a week because the habit was deep and the reasons for it had only multiplied. He had business at the feed store and the bank and relationships with buyers who came through Caldwell. He sat sometimes on the bench outside Hargrove's in the morning and had coffee with Clem or Raymond or other men who were building their version of a life on this same stretch of plains. And he still wore a ring, though not on his right hand anymore. He had had his father's ring fitted properly for Beatrice, and she wore it daily without taking it off, and he wore a plain gold band that they had bought from a jeweler in Wichita for his left hand to match hers. The question was answered. The ring was where it belonged. Beatrice taught at the Caldwell School until 1884, when the school board expanded the school to 2 rooms and hired a second teacher, a young man named Mr. Crawford who had come from Topeka with excellent credentials. Beatrice trained him herself, which she did with characteristic thoroughness, and then stepped back from full-time teaching to part-time, coming in 3 days a week to manage the older students while Crawford handled the younger ones. This arrangement gave her more time at the house and at the land, and she began to do something she had been thinking about since 1880. She organized a lending library in Caldwell, which she ran from the front room of the church with Mrs. Foster's enthusiastic support. It was a small operation at first, books borrowed and lent on an honor system, but it grew as she solicited donations from businesses in Wichita and as more families arrived in Caldwell with books to contribute. She told Robert about it on a Thursday evening in the spring of 1884, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the boys asleep in their room, and she laid out the plan with her usual precision, the location, the system, the costs, the expected benefits to the community. He listened to all of it and then he said, "How much will you need to start it?" And she named a figure and he said, "I will take it from the fall account," which was the household account they used for large, non-regular expenses, and she looked at him across the lamp in the particular way she sometimes did, warm and complete. "You did not even consider saying no," she said. "Why would I?" he said. "It is a good idea. It will work. You always make things work." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her fingers were warm and the ring on her hand was familiar against his skin. "I love you," she said, and it was not the first time she had said it. They said it easily and often, but the quality of it in that moment was particularly full. "I love you," he said, and meant it in all the specific ways he had learned to mean it, which were more numerous and more interesting than he would have thought possible 4 years ago. The lending library opened in June of 1884 and became, within 6 months, one of the things Caldwell was most quietly proud of. Farmers' wives who had not read a book since their schooling came in and left with something under their arms and returned 2 weeks later with opinions about what they had found. The older students at the school used it for their assignments and then for their own purposes, which was the most satisfying outcome of all. Mrs. Foster called it the best thing that had happened to Caldwell since the railroad, which was high praise from a woman who did not give compliments carelessly. Edmund was 4 in the fall of 1884, and William was 2, and the Hartwell house was full in a way Robert would have found impossible to imagine in the solitary years before Beatrice. Mornings were loud and complex, and the kitchen was always slightly chaotic, and the dog they had acquired, a big brown hound Edmund had named Major in a fit of ambition, slept across the doorway and required navigation. Robert loved all of it without reservation. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1884, when the plains were the color they got in fall, russet and gold and the brown of deep grass, Robert and Beatrice rode out together to the north boundary of his land. The boys were with Martha Patterson for the afternoon, which was a regular arrangement that suited everyone. They rode companionably in the familiar way of people who have ridden together many times, and when they reached the fence line they stopped and looked out across the country. It was a long view. The plains ran out to the horizon in every direction with nothing to interrupt them except the low hills to the east and the distant glitter of the creek to the west. And the sky above was enormous and completely blue, and the light was the low, warm gold of October on the Kansas plains that Robert had tried to describe to Beatrice before she had seen it and had failed, and then had stopped trying because some things needed to be experienced. "I remember you telling me about this light," she said, looking out across it. "I told you I could not describe it properly. You were right." She was quiet for a moment. "It is exactly like you, though." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Warm and clear and completely without pretense," she said. "You are exactly what you appear to be, Robert. That is rarer than people understand." He sat with that for a moment, the way he sat with things she said that went deep. "You are the most honest person I have ever known," he said, "and I mean that as the highest thing I can say." She turned to look at him, and the light was on her face, hazel eyes warm and the auburn in her hair touched gold by October, and she was 31 years old and beautiful in the particular way that a person is beautiful when they are entirely themselves, nothing edited or performed. "We have done well," she said. "We have," he agreed. They stayed on the north boundary for a long time, watching the light change as the sun moved, and Major, who had followed them out from the house despite being told not to, appeared from the tall grass at the fence line and sat next to Robert's horse with the self-satisfied expression of a dog who has made his point. Robert looked down at the dog and then at Beatrice, and she was already laughing, and he laughed with her, and the sound of it went out across the plains and was absorbed by all that space without any loss. In the spring of 1885, Beatrice told Robert she was expecting a third child. "Are you glad?" she asked him, and the question was genuine. She wanted to know. "I am more than glad," he said. "Are you?" She thought about it in her characteristic way. "I am glad," she said. "I am also aware that 3 children is considerably more complicated than 2, and that I will need to find someone reliable to manage the library on the days I am not managing it." "Dolores Hargrove," he said immediately, because Dolores had been involved in the library from the beginning and was thoroughly capable. "I thought the same thing," she said and smiled. The third child was a girl, born in October of 1885, and they named her Clara after Robert's mother. She arrived in the world at dawn, which seemed characteristic given what she turned out to be, a child who operated at her own timing and on her own terms from the very beginning. She had dark hair like Robert and Beatrice's directness, and a laugh that came out of her from infancy like something completely decided. Edmund, who was 5, regarded his baby sister with wary fascination. William, who was 3, sat next to Beatrice on the bed and patted Clara's head with a gentleness that made Robert's throat tighten. Robert held Clara that first morning while Beatrice slept, standing by the window with the dawn coming in, and the baby looked up at him with eyes that were still the unfocused dark of newborns, and he talked to her quietly, not about anything particular, just told her about the land, about how the light came in from the east and what the plains looked like at different times of year, and about her grandmother Clara Hartwell, who she was named for, and about a man named Edmund who had pressed a gold ring into his son's palm and said, "Find a woman who deserves it." He was right, Robert told the baby, who was listening with the serious inward attention of the very young. He was completely right. In 1886, Clem Patterson's eldest son, a boy of 17 named Isaac who had grown up watching Robert Hartwell manage his operation with consistent good sense, came to Robert and asked for work. Robert gave him a trial month and then hired him properly, and Isaac Patterson turned out to be one of those young people who has absorbed more than anyone knew from watching adults who do things well. He learned quickly and worked hard and understood horses in a way that reminded Robert of himself at that age. With Isaac's help, Robert was able to take one of the things he had been considering for 2 years and actually do it. He purchased the adjacent parcel to the east, adding 60 acres to his operation, and built a second small barn and expanded the windbreak. The operation was now one of the larger independent cattle ventures in Sumner County. Not the largest. There were men with more capital and more land, but solid and well-regarded and profitable in a consistent way that Robert had always valued over spectacular but unreliable returns. Beatrice managed the household accounts with the same systematic precision she had brought to the school and the library. She had implemented a record system that tracked income and expenditure monthly and quarterly and yearly, and she could look at any period in their financial life and tell you exactly where they had been and what they had done, which was a form of knowledge that gave them both a security that was not merely financial. The library had grown by 1886 to hold over 300 volumes, which was a remarkable number for a small Kansas town, and Mrs. Foster had written a letter to the Kansas State Library Commission about it, which had resulted in a small annual grant that allowed Beatrice to purchase new materials systematically rather than relying entirely on donations. Raymond Hargrove had built a proper shelving unit for it, taking up most of the church's side room, and people came from farms as far as 15 miles away to borrow books. One evening in November of 1886, Robert came in from the barn to find Beatrice sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand and an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" he said. "A letter from the Kansas State Normal School," she said. "They are asking if I would consider coming to Emporia to teach at the school itself. They want someone with experience in frontier education specifically." He sat down across from her and looked at her face, which was the document he had been reading for 9 years and which he trusted absolutely. "That is a significant offer," he said. "It is," she said. "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment and he waited, because that was what you did when Beatrice was thinking through something real. "I have thought about this kind of question before," she said. "When I was in Abilene before I came to Caldwell, I thought about what I was building toward. I thought it was a teaching career of a certain kind, advancement, reputation, that sort of thing." She paused. "I do not think that anymore. What do you think now?" "I think I am building something here," she said simply. "With you, with the boys and Clara, with the library and the school. It is not nothing to be offered what they are offering, and I do not want to pretend it is. But Emporia is not here, and here is what I have chosen and keep choosing." She looked at him directly. "I am going to decline." He looked at her. "Are you certain?" "I need you to be certain, Beatrice, not just saying what you think I want to hear." "When have I ever said what people want to hear?" she said, and there was the dry warmth that he had loved since October of 1877. "Never," he admitted. "Not once." "Then trust that," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the ring, and held it. "Write them a good letter," he said. "Thank them properly." "I already drafted it," she said, and produced 2 pages of careful handwriting from beside her, which made him laugh in the full, unguarded way she had always been able to draw out of him. By 1887, Edmund was 7 and attending the Caldwell School under Mr. Crawford, who had been there long enough to have become an institution himself. Edmund was a practical, engaged student who had his mother's capacity for organizing information and his father's patience with difficulty, and he was popular with both children and adults in the way of children who are fundamentally comfortable with themselves. William, at 5, was about to begin school for the first time, and Beatrice was determined not to treat his first day differently from any other child's, which was one of the harder things she did that year. She handed him to Mr. Crawford at the schoolhouse door and walked back home and spent the morning at the library with a concentration that was visibly effortful. And when she picked William up at the end of the day, and he said, with his characteristic seriousness, that it had been quite interesting, actually, she held him slightly longer than necessary before she let him go. Clara, at 2, was conducting her own education of the household and the farmyard with great energy and zero hesitation. She had developed a particular relationship with Major the dog, who tolerated from her things he tolerated from no one else, and she had discovered that the horses responded to a certain quality of sound she made, and she spent long periods at the fence of the paddock having what appeared to be conversations with them. Robert watched this with deep fondness and told Beatrice that Clara was going to be a horse person, and Beatrice said that was fine as long as she was also a reading person, and they had both agreed she was likely to be several kinds of person simultaneously. There was a hard winter in 1887 into 1888, one of the genuinely difficult ones that the plains could produce, with temperatures that dropped below what the thermometer in Hargrove's store could read and snow that stayed for 6 weeks without melting and ice that made the roads impassable for days at a time. Robert and Isaac managed the cattle with the methodical discipline of experienced cattlemen, losing 3 animals to cold, which was a painful but manageable loss, and keeping the rest alive by sheer consistent effort. Beatrice managed the house with the same methodical discipline, keeping the stoves banked and the children warm and the larder organized so that nothing was wasted and everything stretched. She read to the children every evening during those 6 weeks, long stretches of whatever was on the shelf, and the house was warm inside even when the wind was building drifts against the north wall, and Robert, coming in from the barn at the end of each day with his hands cold and his bones tired, would hear her voice before he was through the door, and something in him settled and rested. One particularly hard night in January of 1888, when the cold was at its worst, and the wind was making sounds against the house that the children did not like, Robert and Beatrice sat up after the children were in bed, close to the big kitchen stove, and she leaned against him, and he had his arm around her, and they did not talk about anything difficult. She told him about a book she was reading. He told her about a conversation he had had with Isaac that day that had made him think the young man was ready for more responsibility. They talked in the comfortable way of people who have said all the necessary things a long time ago and can now simply be present with each other in the luxury of ordinary evenings. He was thinking, not for the first time, about how far he had come from the man who rode into Caldwell alone in the mornings with a ring on his right hand and an unanswered question. That man had been adequate to his life but incomplete, the way a house is adequate for shelter but not yet a home. "What are you thinking?" she asked, because she could read him as well as he could read her. "About the ring," he said, "about my father." She turned her hand in his and looked at the ring, plain and gold in the firelight. "You wore it every day," she said, "all that time. Every day I came to town. Looking for me," she said, and she did not make it sentimental, just stated it as the factual, extraordinary thing it was. "Looking for the woman who deserved it," he said, which turned out to be the same thing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I am glad you did not give up." "I never thought of it as something to give up," he said. "I just knew it had to be right. My father knew the difference between wanting and deserving. I believe I do now too." She tilted her head and looked at him with the full warmth of 9 years of a life built together. "You always did," she said. "You were just waiting for the evidence." The winter broke in March of 1888, and the plains came back to life with the particular force that follows a hard winter, green and urgent and full of birds. The cattle recovered. The roads cleared. The school resumed its regular schedule after the extended disruption, and Beatrice spent the first week of spring term doing comprehensive assessments of where every one of her students had landed during the months of intermittent attendance, so she could rebuild the curriculum from where they actually were rather than where she wished they were. Clem Patterson came to visit in April with the news that his family was considering moving south to a new territory opening in what would eventually become Oklahoma, where land was available and cheaper. Robert listened to this and felt the particular sadness of watching a good man choose a different path, and he and Beatrice had Clem and Martha to dinner, and they sat around the kitchen table long after the food was done, talking about the future in the abstract way that people do when they know a goodbye is coming. Clem and Martha left in June of 1888, taking Isaac with them, which meant Robert needed a new hand, and also lost a good friend in daily proximity, which was the harder of the two losses. He hired a man named Henry Tull, a quiet, capable former drover of about 40 who had settled down after years on the trail and knew cattle as well as any man Robert had met. Edmund, at 8, had begun helping in the barn in the mornings before school, which was something he had asked for rather than been assigned, and Robert was careful to let him do real work rather than pretend work, because Beatrice had been right that a child who does real things learns real things. Edmund could muck a stall properly and fill water troughs and check the fence line nearest the house, and he did these things with a focused seriousness that made Robert and Beatrice exchange looks across the breakfast table with a warmth they did not need to explain. In September of 1888, Beatrice told Robert she was expecting again. He looked at her across the kitchen in the morning light, and she looked at him back, and they were both aware, wordlessly, of the shape of their life. 3 children already, a full house, a busy and purposeful day-to-day existence, and the knowledge that all of that was simply expanding rather than changing. "Are you glad?" he asked, as she had once asked him. "Very," she said, without hesitation. The 4th child was born in April of 1889, another girl, and they named her Anna. She was a placid, sunny baby who slept well and ate well, and regarded the world with an amiable interest that was immediately endearing. Clara, who was 3, was suspicious of her at first, and then decided within a week that Anna was an acceptable project, and took to sitting next to the baby's cradle and talking to her in a low, authoritative voice that made everyone in the house smile. Edmund, at 9, took his status as eldest seriously and was generally a stabilizing force. William, at 7, was in his own world most of the time but showed up reliably when needed. The Hartwell household in 1889 was loud and warm and well-organized in its essential structure, even when the daily surface of it was chaotic, which it often was. Robert stood in the doorway of the bedroom one evening and watched Beatrice nurse the baby in the last light of the day, with the window behind her going amber and rose, and Edmund's voice could be heard from the other room reading to William, and Major's heavy breathing was audible from somewhere nearby. He stood there and felt the full, complete weight of a life that had been built brick by brick from the moment he rode into Caldwell on a Tuesday morning in October of 1877, and watched a woman in a faded green dress pat a brown mare's neck at the water trough. He still wore his wedding ring every day. He still went to town regularly, for all the same reasons and new ones. The question on his right hand was long answered, its answer resting on Beatrice's left hand and present in the faces of 4 children, and in the shape of everything they had built together on this stretch of Kansas plains. His father had said, "Find a woman who deserves it." He had ridden into Caldwell for 3 years carrying that injunction, wearing the ring as a kind of promise, a daily renewal of the intention. He had not known what the woman would look like, or where she would come from, or what the moment of recognition would feel like. He had trusted that he would know it when he found it because his father had known it when he found it, and whatever capacity for that kind of knowledge was in Edmund Hartwell was also in Robert Hartwell. He had been right. The woman who deserved it had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October with a wagon full of furniture and a burned arrangement, and the controlled, precise determination to build something worthwhile out of a situation that had not cooperated. She had shaken his hand like a person rather than a woman. She had answered his questions without performance. She had said in the middle of a February road, with the practical directness that was the most attractive thing about her, "I think you have found her." She had been right. In the spring of 1890, when Anna was a year old and just beginning to pull herself upright on the furniture, and Edmund was 10 and a confirmed student of the natural world, and William was 8, and reading everything the library contained, And Clara was 4 and already certain she was going to be the most capable person in any room she entered. Robert and Beatrice rode out together on a Sunday afternoon the way they had always done when time allowed. They went to the north boundary, which was a habit of theirs now, a regular return to the place where they had stood in October of 1884 and looked out across the country together. The land was different with 9 more years on it, the operation larger, the barn visible to the south with the new addition Robert and Henry Tull had put up the previous summer, and the windbreak of trees along the north fence taller now, well established, casting real shade. The light was the same, though. The low, warm, particular light of Kansas in good weather, falling clean and golden across the grass, making everything it touched look like something worth keeping. Edmund would be pleased, Beatrice said. She meant Robert's father, as she always did when she said Edmund without specification. He would, Robert said. He was a man who liked to see things grow. She looked out across the land and he watched her profile, the 10 years they had been together sitting comfortably on her, her hair fully auburn now without the bonnet she had stopped wearing after the first year, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that were the accumulated evidence of the frequency with which she had laughed. She was 37 and she was more beautiful to him than she had been in Hargrove's store on the morning they met, which was not a thing he had expected to be true but which was simply, factually, the case. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the library," she said. "Mrs. Foster thinks we should approach the town council about a proper building, something purpose-built, not just the church's side room." She paused. "I agree with her." "How much would it cost?" "She has some figures. I want to look at them more carefully before I bring them to you." "When have you ever brought me something you had not already worked through?" he said. She smiled at the planes. "However," she admitted, "I trust your figures," he said, "and I trust your argument. If you think the town is ready to hear it, make it." She turned to look at him and the smile was still there but fuller now, carrying all the specific years of their specific life. "You know," she said, "you have always been like that." "Like what?" "Just there," she said. "Without conditions, just entirely, consistently there." He looked at her for a long moment. The ring on her hand caught the light the way it always did. The same ring his father had pressed into his palm. The same gold, the same plain circle, the same promise that had been carried across the miles and the years until it found the hand it was always meant for. "Where else would I be?" he said. She reached across and took his hand, the one with his own ring on it, and they sat on their horses at the north boundary of the land they had built together. And the October light fell warm and clear across everything they owned, the land, the cattle, the house where 4 children were moving through their afternoon, the library full of borrowed books, the school on the corner of Commerce and Third. The whole wide life that had begun with a gold ring and a question and a woman in a faded green dress who had shaken his hand like a person and told him her name, Beatrice Leland, who had become Beatrice Hartwell, and who wore the ring that had been waiting for her on the finger it had been made for, and who deserved it in every way that mattered, not because she was perfect or uncomplicated or easy, but because she was fully and exactly herself. And that was what his father had meant. That was what he had always meant. The wind came across the plains from the west, warm and steady, bending the tall grass in long, flowing waves, and the two of them sat together in the middle of all that space and all that light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that a life, built carefully and chosen freely and shared completely, could be. Major appeared from somewhere in the grass below them, looking up with his reliable expression of having done something clever. A hawk circled high above in the blue. Somewhere back at the house, Clara's voice was audible in the distance, organizing something or someone with characteristic authority. Robert Hartwell looked at his wife in the afternoon light, and she looked back at him. And between them was the easy, full silence of people who have said what needs saying and will keep saying it, every day, for as many days as they are given. He had worn his father's ring to town every day hoping to find the woman who deserved it. He had found her. And every morning after that, When the light came in through the east window of the house on the Kansas plains, and the day began its necessary and beloved noise, he knew it with a completeness that needed no further proof, no further searching, only the daily fact of her presence and the daily choice of the life they had made together, which was, in the end, precisely what his father had known when he pressed a plain gold ring into his son's palm and said simply, "Find a woman who deserves it." Edmund Hartwell had been right about all of it.